Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be joining you today virtually, and especially to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is livestock and innovation. And specifically today, we're going to look at three paradigm shifts that are happening in the world of livestock as it relates to innovation. So, by way of introduction, I am Janette Barnard. I'm from southeastern Arizona, where I grew up on a farm and ranch. This photo behind me is actually the farm where I grew up. Those are my parents' cattle. And growing up in this setting, I was surrounded by a family of producers who highly valued excellence and they highly valued innovation. And so I think that kind of influenced, not kind of, that significantly influenced my own career and the work that I find myself doing here at the intersection of animal agriculture and innovation. So let's jump right into it. What are the three paradigms that are shifting as it relates to animal ag and innovation? The first one is this idea of the lunatic farmer's role in spreading innovation. Let me explain what I mean by lunatic farmer. I'm going to read you a quote. This is by the author Alan Nation, who has written pretty extensively about extensive beef systems and becoming more profitable as a cattle grazer. So here's the quote. The innovative farmer is seen by his farm neighbors as a lunatic farmer, and a lunatic farmer is not seen as a role model. As a result, what the innovator does on his or her farm is literally invisible to the neighbors. This is true even if the innovation is producing visible wealth. The normal reaction to unconventional success is the old, it might work there, but not here syndrome. You guys know what he's talking about, right? The sad truth is the vast majority of farmers prefer to fail conventionally rather than to succeed unconventionally. It is very, very difficult to be more innovative than the community in which you live. I love that concept. And to me, lunatic farmers, these are the producers that are really pushing the boundaries. These are going to be the early adopters of a new technology. They're going to be the early adopters of a new practice. They're going to be the early adopters of any sort of new product. And they're going to be figuring it out and figuring out how to capture ROI, figuring out how to incorporate in their system while the other producers are still sitting back, shaking their head, wondering why producer is doing this. My granddad actually kind of always had a name for the folks that criticize the lunatic farmers. And he actually just called them the coffee shop boys. He said they're the farmers. They're sitting around the coffee shop instead of being out in their field. And they're the ones that are criticizing. They're talking about why this won't work, or that won't work. All the while, the lunatic farmer is out there just figuring it out and making it happen. So if the lunatic farmer is who we want to be working with as innovators, how do we spot them? How do we know that someone is a lunatic farmer and not just a lunatic, right? So I think there are a few ways. The first is that these are people who get out of their bubble, right? They are reading what their competitors are not reading. They're listening to people that their competitors are not listening to. They're having conversations and they're trying to learn from other industries. And they're looking at, how do I go learn as quickly as possible and pull that learning into my own operation in really practical ways, right? So the second thing is these are people that are super curious. They're asking questions. Not only are they going to non-traditional places for information and insights, but they're asking really curious and looking for application in their own operation. I think a third way that you identify a lunatic farmer is these are people who experiment. They create time and financial margin to always be running experiments. And you can ask them, what experiments are you running right now? What are you testing? What are you playing with? And they'll tell you, whether it's genetics, whether it's nutrition, whether it's talent management and how they keep people on staff. Whatever it is, these are people that are always pushing the boundaries and always running experiments, knowing that, every incremental win from an experiment can be folded into the system. And that's the fourth way that you identify a lunatic farmer is they are looking at their business model in terms of a system, and they are innovating not just in specific aspects of the business model, but in the business model as a whole, right? It's that whole idea of working on the business versus working in the business. When I think of this business model innovation, I think of the flywheel concept, and no company is a better example of the flywheel concept than Amazon, right? So Amazon said, all right, we need to get a lot of customers. In order to get a lot of customers, we need low price. So we get lower prices, we get a lot of customers, then we go get more sellers. And if we have more sellers, that allows us to add increased variety of selection. So then we get more customers. And then as we have more customers and more margin, then that allows us to invest in ways to lower our prices, right? So it just becomes this flywheel. An example that I think of that is a producer that I recently spoke with out of Kansas, right? It's a dairy operation that's growing rapidly. They're really aggressively innovative on a number of dimensions. And I was asking him about, how he thinks about keeping people engaged, right? How he thinks about growth, and how do you know when growth is at the right pace, and all of these types of notions that a growing producer has to consider. And he said, you know what, there's a virtuous cycle here of as you are growing your business, it creates a lot of interesting challenges that smart people want to work on, right? So you're growing your business, which attracts smart people. And when you attract smart people, you have more capacity to grow your business. And I just love that framework. I've never specifically thought about talent management in a production system in that way. And so just really appreciated that perspective. And that's just a small example of the types of business model innovation that these lunatic farmers are doing. So lunatic farmers. I would also suggest that there is an increase in the number of lunatic farmers, and it's becoming as margins are becoming more thin, as markets are more volatile. You start to see the lunatic farmers. Those are the ones that are growing either in numbers, or they're growing as the result of profit in terms of how they're running their business. How do we see that? That brings us to our second paradigm shift. It's the shift of either I'm going to get really, really, really aggressive on scale as a path to compete in a commodity market, or I'm going to focus on de-commoditization. And whereas I think in the past, you would have had a lot of producers say, you know what, I'm not into brand building. I'm not into dealing with customers. I'm not into marketing in some definition. I just want to produce. You're starting to see that shift now of more producers saying, hold on a second. If I'm not going to go down the scale path, I've got to do something to be competitive. And so I'm going to go down the value path, de-commoditization. And I think this is really an area that we're starting to see, especially in the United States. I would call out, especially in the beef industry. There are a few examples of this that we could point to. Some of these producers are moving down direct to consumer sales channels. Instead of taking animals to the sale barn, I'm going to finish them myself, and then I'm going to sell directly to consumers. That's a whole different business model than many of those producers would have considered in years past, that they're now looking at and now engaging in. And there are more tools to help them do that, right? But even for producers that don't want to go down that path, one example is finding specific supply chains to sell into, right? So an example that we see in the United States is that of Walmart, one of the largest retailers in the world, saying, you know what, we really need to own a piece of our own supply chain as it relates to beef. They're really trying to ramp up the quality of meat that they're selling at the meat case. And so Walmart went and found a partner in a company called 44 Farms that already has a proprietary genetics that they sell across the United States. This is a company that already finishes some cattle and processes those and sells those direct to consumer. So Walmart said to 44 Farms, let's build a supply chain, right? And I would call this, you can call this a virtually integrated supply chain. We can call this an aligned supply chain, a coordinated supply chain. It's not necessarily vertically integrated because Walmart doesn't truly own it, but it is a very close partnership. This is not a commodity supply chain, right? This is a supply chain that's saying, we're going to produce and meet these specs for this specific customer. And in order to make sure that we can deliver that quality at the meat case, we've got to get it right in the processing plant. We've got to get it right at the feed yard. We've got to get it right at the cow-calf level. And we've got to get it right all the way back to the genetics. So this is one coordinated supply chain. And so I've recently been talking with a lot of producers that are starting to sell into that supply chain or other supply chains like that. It's a way to decrease risk, increase predictability of cash flow, increase predictability of demand, increase predictability of assurance of who am I going to sell this product to and for how much? How do I take some of the volatility out of my business? And so to me, that's really an example of this de-commoditization, even though at the same time, I've recently talked to producers that are continuing to scale up, continuing with the objective of be the lowest cost per unit producer, right? And those are just two very different business models, which all comes back to the lunatic farmer and innovating around that business model itself, right? So this brings us then to the third paradigm shift that I want to talk about today. And that's the idea of shifting from independent producer to collaborator. Now, there's a story I like to tell when I talk about this collaboration concept. Actually, so here in Southeast Arizona, there is a family that they've been ranching in the area for 5 to 6 generations since the 1800s. Okay. And they are fiercely independent. They recently, several years ago, got into a spat with the United States government over some of their public lands leases, right? A lot of mistrust on both sides, going back to a lot of issues. But at the core, the way someone boiled it down to me, they said, you know what, that family is just fiercely independent because they've had to be in order to survive. And you think about all that family has survived in these 100+ years of producing cattle in a desert region. They've survived droughts. They've survived mountain lion attacks. They've survived crashing markets. They've just survived it all, right? And it's this fiercely independent nature that has served them really well. But what's starting to shift in today's market is that those who are the most independent are not those that are the best positioned to win. It's those that are collaborating effectively that are best positioned to win. An example of this in the United States is that of the growing trend around beef on dairy, right? Or dairy beef supply chains, where your dairy operations are using sex semen to breed their very best cows and their very best heifers to get those dairy genetics and dairy replacement heifers. And then they're breeding everything else to beef bulls, right? So now we have an offspring that instead of worth $20 to $50 at day one is now worth $100 to $125 or more. Now we can either maintain ownership and feed those animals out all the way until the processing plant, or we can sell them at a higher value as very young calves, right? Two options, but the point is that we're increasing the value of those animals. And one of the things I've heard consistently from producers is that in order to pull off this whole dairy beef concept, you have to have really good partners. You have to have cattle feeding partners. Let's just back up and say dairy producers, yes, they feed cattle, but they're not cattle feeders in the sense of finishing cattle. And so a dairy producer doesn't have the expertise in-house to effectively finish cattle. So they've got to find the right partner. They've got to have the right structure in place around that arrangement. They're looking for a partner that can help them finish cattle really well, even though those cattle might be a little bit different than just straight beef cattle that the feeder is used to, right? And then the feed yard has to have a relationship with the packer, because there are some nuances around the carcass that have to be, the packer has to be comfortable and willing to accept those carcasses and value them appropriately. So what you see is non-traditional partners, from dairy producer to cattle feeder to packer, are now working together on these supply chains where those are not traditional collaborations, right? But there's a lot of value being created as a result of those collaborations. And so that's really an example of this idea of those who collaborate are going to be best positioned to win in the years going forward. Not that there isn't still a place for this fierce independence and perseverance that we know and love about livestock producers historically. But I think it's those that can make that transition, that can open up and figure out how to put the right partnerships and collaborations in place that can collaborate the most effectively and be in a competitive position to win going forward. The funny thing is that that's also true for technology companies, right? There's a lot of companies that want to be it all, right? Everybody wants to be the platform. Not everybody can be the platform. Producers don't want 25 different logins, right? So even from a technology perspective, I think this idea of collaboration and who and where and when and how are you collaborating? How are you being an ecosystem player to create and unlock new value for your customers becomes really relevant. So those are the three paradigm shifts. This idea of the lunatic farmer as the path to spreading innovation, this idea of scaling up or increasing value, and that shift to de-commoditized production. That's where innovative farmers are really focusing. And then the third one is this idea of shifting from an independent mindset to collaborator. I think those are three interesting paradigms that we're going to continue to see play out in the coming years. I'm bullish on the future of animal protein. This is something that I always say in the weekly newsletter that I write called Prime Future, which is a newsletter for innovators in livestock, meat, and dairy. But I'm bullish on the future of animal protein specifically because of these paradigms, specifically because of these lunatic type producers who are really pushing the boundaries and who are changing the business of livestock production and animal protein. So thank you for allowing me to be with all of you today.